My name is BJ Jungman. I'm the fire chief for the city of Burnsville. I am here representing the Minnesota Fire Service Association Coalition, and our coalition represents 4 fire service organizations: the Minnesota State Fire Chiefs Association, the Minnesota Fire Department Association, the Fire Marshals Association of Minnesota, and the International Association of Arson Investigators Minnesota chapter. So it's different segments of the fire service that all come together to work on legislative issues. I think the Chiefs Association is pretty self-explanatory. It's the leadership of fire departments that belong to that. The Fire Department Association tends to represent the members of many departments, particularly the volunteer and rural departments. The Fire Marshals Association is a coalition of the fire marshals from all of our cities, and then the arson investigators are the folks not only in the public sector and the fire service that investigate the fires in our state, but also the private fire investigators that work for the insurance companies and specialists in the arson investigation field. So I appreciate your time today. I think we're going to give you a quick overview of the fire service and where we're at today and where we're going.
Go ahead and continue.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So real quick, Minnesota has the second highest percentage of volunteer fire departments across the nation at 93%. So we are primarily served by volunteer firefighters, which has served us well for many, many years. And when you look at it, 687 of our fire departments of the 780 are considered all volunteer departments. There are 74 departments that are considered combination, where they have a combination of full-time and paid-on-call or volunteer staff. You may hear them referred to in different ways. There's very few true volunteer departments left out there. You hear them lots of times considered paid per call, so they might get paid $10 or $12 per call, whether that's a 1-hour call or an 8-hour call. We still consider those volunteer departments. That's not a career or scheduled type of department. And then when you look at that, the vast majority of our departments are comprised of those volunteer firefighters. We estimated about 19,000 of the 21,000 firefighters in our state are considered volunteer or paid per call firefighters. So again, primarily served by those in your community that live there, that are willing to give their time to serve their community. When you compare that regionally, which is the graph on the bottom right there, excuse me, when you look at the number of firefighters per 10,000 of population, we have the lowest total and the lowest career and volunteer firefighters. The red on that first graph is the career, and yellow is volunteer firefighters. Within that, the kind of upper right graph talks about the number of fire stations per 10,000 of capita, and again, when you look in our 5-state region, we have the lowest number, and the same thing with the number of actual fire departments at 780 fire departments in our state. So we make it work on a very efficient scale with very few people in comparison. So really, what does it take? Well, it takes a lot of money really to get a firefighter up and running. That's about $27,000, and that's just for the equipment and the training to get someone ready. And we're not talking salaries, we're not talking anything else. This is true whether you're a volunteer firefighter or whether you're a full-time firefighter. When you look at the amount of training that someone has to go through, when you look at the equipment that they need to be fully equipped as a firefighter, you're looking at about a $27,000 investment to go from street clothes and no education to being fully qualified to be a firefighter. One more statistic really on the spending is we're 47th in the nation, and actually in 2014 we moved up to 46th. The data hasn't been published yet on that, and at the same time we're 21st in the nation on population. So a quick overview of what does the fire service provide? I think lots of times people think of fires and we pull up in a big red truck and put out burning buildings. Well, that's one of the service lines that we provide, but we do a lot more for the communities that we serve. So fire suppression is the one that you probably see the most. We also do fire prevention, and fire prevention really can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different communities, anything from inspections to fire investigations to public education. So there's a lot of things that fall under that fire prevention umbrella. We also do a lot of public education, and lots of times that's not just on fire prevention, it's how do people be safe how can they be safe and healthier in their home? Things like not only checking their smoke detector, but do they have trip hazards? Do we have things that are going to keep them safer? We also do technical rescue at various levels. And technical rescue is anything from needing a rope rescue off the side of a water tower to trench rescue to vehicle extrication for someone that's entrapped in a vehicle at a car accident. We do hazardous materials, so if something spills and it's harmful to people or the environment, we get called to those as well. And probably our biggest growing service line is the emergency medical services. As we have an aging demographic, we tend to see more and more medical calls. Regardless of whether your fire department provides the ambulance service, they are usually engaged at some level of first response in the EMS system, because generally they're trained to provide medical aid to people within your community. And when you look at that growing population and the need for emergency medical services, the fire departments are generally pretty engaged, and you'll see that the call volume continues to rise there and is predicted to for a number of years to come. So then you go, what are the pressures on the fire service? What's really our driving factors? And I will tell you, the number one is the recruitment and retention of volunteer firefighters. We hear this across the state. People's lives have changed, the expectations have changed, and really the recruitment is one issue. And you talk the changing demographics. Well, the millennials coming out have different values and have different things. They don't own as many homes as we used to. So even if you do get them, how long do they stay? Anecdotally, a lot of departments are saying they're lucky to keep these volunteers 5 years. Well, if they spend the first 18 months in training, you're getting 3 years out of these folks before they turn over. So that high turnover rate is very difficult. It's also difficult to get them to stay in that community. It's difficult to get them during the day. If you think at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, if you have a fire and you're running a volunteer fire department, who's showing up? You hope that you have some shift workers that work overnights or they work shift work somewhere else so that you have a handful of folks. But really the recruitment is an issue, and then the retention is also an issue, as I talked about, kind of that 5-year average. Resources, and that's both financial and the human piece. We talked a little about the recruitment and retention, which is our firefighters, which are our most valuable resource, and then really that financial piece. It continues to increase in cost providing the service. The equipment we buy becomes more and more expensive each year. The regulation and the training that we need to provide continues to be more and more costly.
Mr. Jungman, I believe Representative Pino has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief, I'm curious, your point about folks being trained but then moving after a couple of years and maybe move to a different community, that sort of thing. I'm just curious, is it common or becoming increasingly common? I guess I would hope so, that as folks are moving around, they might be trained in one community, but now they've got those skills, they could then join as a volunteer firefighter in a different community, and moving between communities in that way, versus they get trained, they're there, but then once they leave, they're lost entirely. Thank you.
Mr. Jungman?
Mr. Chair, committee members, that is correct. We do see some of that, but I would tell you lots of times they're moving out of our state. These people are moving long ways, and the other thing is their career grows and their family grows. The ability for people to give the time that we need decreases. So generally you might see them move once, join another department for a couple years, and then they're done. So even though you might get a couple years out of them in a new department, generally you're not seeing them stay the 20 years we used to see. So yeah, you do see a little bit of movement of some trained firefighters, but that's really a small minority of the folks that are moving around.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Pino, any follow-up?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jungman.
Thank you. Also some unfunded mandates. I will give you an example. Is last year there was changes in the EMS education standards. So that created an unfunded mandate to the departments to maintain their EMS certifications, and some changes in requirements in those departments to provide more training. Compliance with things like OSHA. We talked about hazardous materials compliance with the PCA regulations to make sure we're doing the right thing. That takes equipment, that takes time, that takes training of our folks. So there's a number of different standards out there. The sustainability of the current models is at jeopardy, I think. When you look at it, when we see that decreasing volunteerism, how do we continue to provide this service reliably to our communities? So we want to make sure that we do that into the future. So we're looking at what does the future model look like? And then that evolving health and wellness challenges, as we see really 3 primary drivers of that. And one of the associations that isn't here that we try to partner up with whenever we can is the Minnesota Professional Firefighters, that represents the union firefighters in the state. Is really we're all seeing the same thing, whether you're volunteer or full-time, is the cardiac stress on people and the increase in heart attacks, the increase in cancer that we have a hard time getting data on, and then the third one is the post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's across all of public safety, as we're seeing a lot more mental health with the things that all of the folks in public safety see. And it's not necessarily one instance. Lots of times it's the chronic. Over a 20-year career, the things that you see you can't forget, and it's tough to deal with. So those are a quick rundown of some of the pressures that we see in the fire service. So one of the things that is very helpful in Minnesota is the fire safety account. I'm guessing most of you are pretty familiar with that, but that fire safety account is dedicated revenue that goes to the fire service, and statutorily it's really aimed at three things, and that's funding the state fire marshal's office, which is wholly funded out of the fire safety account, the Minnesota Board of Firefighter Training and Education, and the regional response teams. So as I talked about, the fire marshal's office is a great asset to the fire service. They help us in a number of ways, from inspections and code enforcement to fire investigations to being a resource for fire departments and what their needs are and what the regulations are and how to get through those things. The Board of Firefighter Training and Education helps set standards and allows reimbursements to every fire department in the state. Currently, each fire department can get a minimum of $90 this year. With the funds we have, it'll be in excess of $100 and per firefighter per year. And that is very helpful for departments that don't have a training budget. Their training budget might be $1,000. Well, you might not be able to have more than one outside instructor come in per year for that kind of money to do the technical training we need. So this has opened the door to allowing a lot more training to come into the fire service. When you look at the regional response teams, the fire safety account funds the hazmat teams, which respond to those hazmat incidents and have the technical expertise. Again, this is great because we don't need every fire department to be a hazardous materials team. So it's a very efficient way to do that. The same with Task Force 1. Task Force 1 deals with structural collapse. They deal with high-angle rescue. They'll deal with trench rescue or any of those other type of technical rescues that we need help with. And they'll go anywhere in the state. And then the last and probably newest is the Minnesota Air Rescue team, and that is a partnership between St. Paul Fire and the Minnesota State Patrol, and using the helicopter that the State Patrol has to do rescues. And they've been called out a number of times and have had very successful results by having that team available. So again, a very efficient way to leverage regional resources across the state instead of all of us trying to have that expertise. When we look at evaluating the fire service moving forward, we have a training study underway through the Minnesota Board of Firefighter Training and Education that will help us look into the future of what the gaps are at fire service training. There was a rail response study that was just released in the past 2 weeks through HSEM, which helps us deal with what our gaps are with the rail emergencies and pipeline emergencies we're looking at. The regional response team study was completed in October, which has 17 recommendations that we're working with HSEM on to look for solutions for. Again, we talked about the fire safety account. That supports critical functions of the fire service. Without that money, the State Fire Marshal's Office wouldn't exist. The training in many of these departments wouldn't exist, and these regional response teams would not exist. And they are very valuable to our state. We also have 3 fire service specialists in the State Fire Marshal's Office, again, that help many departments navigate the waters of what's going on in the fire service and what assets are out there. And then we're looking at fire service organizations working collaboratively on these solutions, not only legislatively. When I talked about what is the future of the model, that's going to take all of us coming together. That's not necessarily a legislative effort, but we're committed to providing services, our mission is, to every community in the state, and we want to lead through that. And again, it's not always legislative, but we want you to know that we know what some of the challenges are, and we're working to get those resolved or to have a goal.
Okay. Mr. Jungbauer, I believe Representative Ward has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. I'm interested in several aspects of what you're discussing, but particularly want to ask you about the recruitment aspect and looking at our even high school students and informing them of options. I mean, you're really talking about something that would appeal to a lot of young people if they understood the challenges that you face, and it would be really interesting in so many aspects of what you've described. But what are the basic qualifications before you would hire someone and put them through training?
Mr. Chair and committee members, that all depends on the department, but I will tell you most volunteer departments need someone that's 18 or older that passes a background check and has basically a clean criminal record, and then they will put them through all the training after that. Most full-time departments are basically using the volunteer departments kind of as their field team because we have so many volunteer firefighters that they come qualified to most full-time departments. So most of those volunteer departments, again, 93% of the departments in the state have some very minimum qualifications and will provide all the training beyond that. So we're looking for good people that have a good work ethic and a good reputation that are willing to work hard.
Representative Ward, follow-up.
Yes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So do you have, or do any of the departments have any kind of recruitment, going to the job fairs or anything like that, even the college fairs that the schools have, so that kids know that there is an opportunity and they could have a vision of what they could do?
Mr. Jungbauer.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, yeah, I can't speak for every department in the state, but I can tell you most departments in the state have very heavy recruitment efforts in their local community in different ways. I can tell you that Burnsville attends the high school career fair. I can tell you that we partner with the colleges and we're on their advisory committees and we get in front of those students. So we make every effort to get some face time and explain what we're about and what the potential is. Yep.
Representative Ward, any other?
No, thank you.
Representative Newberger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming down here today. A couple of quick questions. Someone joins the volunteer fire department, they get vested, they serve 7, 10, 15, whatever years. And when they're done, they don't make a lot of money because it's a volunteer type of organization. But one thing that we've always had to offer these folks is that if you put in your time when you are done, you're going to get a lump sum retirement check. And usually it's pretty good. And it's money that's put away for that purpose. And I think it's an excellent, it's an excellent tool to attract people into the fire service. I have many of my coworkers who are also volunteers that's part of their retirement package. With that basis set, in Minnesota, once you retire and you draw that lump sum, what happens? You get taxed. You get taxed on your retirement. You get this big lump check, and then the state of Minnesota comes and takes a big bite out of it. I just so happen to have a bill. So would it be helpful, in your opinion, to recruit and retain firefighters if they knew their retirement would be tax exempt?
Mr. Jungbauer?
Mr. Chair, committee members, yes, I think that's another recruitment tool. I don't think there's a singular approach that'll fix the problem, but I do think that is advantageous and is definitely something that would attract people and that we could use as part of our recruitment and retention package.
Representative Newberger, any follow-up?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just one more quick question. Then also, you mentioned the EMT renewal process. Yeah, my heart goes out to you on that. They changed the standards, and I've been through that myself, and it's an arduous, torturous process. What it used to be to what it is now, in my opinion, is redundant, and I know that the EMSRB has a lot of input on that. Is it your opinion that, because we need EMTs in the volunteer services, because these are the folks that are responding in greater Minnesota, is it your opinion that the new renewal standards or the mechanisms by which you renew your EMT, is that a detriment? Are you losing EMTs because of that?
Mr. Jungman?
Mr. Chair and committee members, what I've heard is that it's definitely hurting our rural areas, and it's pushing a lot of people to go from EMT down to EMR, the first responder. So we're losing EMTs to go down to the emergency medical, which is a step below that, is what I'm hearing. I couldn't tell you firsthand. I know it was a challenge for us and a challenge for a number of the agencies that I've talked to. I think it's still too new to say what the outcome is going to be, but I do definitely think it is impacting our rural areas with the ability to retain the EMT level provider. Without an ambulance service, it's very difficult for these folks to keep up that EMT.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Newberger, any more follow-up? Hey, Mr. Youngman, if you want to continue, but I'd like to respond to our members. Might be something we need to look at and find out if these new standards are hurting greater Minnesota, especially with the distances that the ambulance sometimes have to run. It's the fire departments that make the difference in, it could make the difference in lives. So if you want to continue?
Mr. Chair and committee members, thank you. So moving forward, again, what are we doing? The training study, the rail response study, the regional response teams, again, with partnership with many of the DPS divisions. We talked about the fire safety account, the state fire marshal's office, and then us working together to accomplish what our gaps are. So some of our legislative initiatives this year, first and foremost, is to get the appropriation for the base budget of this fire safety account. We would like to allocate $12.9 million of that money to those three topics we talked about: the State Fire Marshal's Office, the Board of Firefighter Training and Education, and the regional response teams. The second piece is a little bit of that, talking about the future, is enabling fire taxing districts. If you look west of Minnesota, Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, California, there's a whole bunch of states that have enabling legislation that allow local municipalities to create fire taxing districts instead of just a joint powers agreement. We have one under special legislation in Minnesota. That would be the Cloquet Area Fire District. This would allow 2 or more local units of government to come together to create a special taxing district and provide fire and EMS service to their communities, or at least fire service, depending on how they're licensed. The third one is we would like to move the fire code from the Department of Labor and Industry to the Department of Public Safety. The Department of Public Safety, or the fire code, is the only code that is not adopted by the agency that's required to enforce the code. Our goal here is to still continue to work collaboratively with the Department of Labor and Industry. The fire code and the building code are really tied together, and what we saw in the last code adoption process is they weren't adopted concurrently. Department of Labor and Industry does not have the staff to do that, and we believe working concurrently with them and hopefully to have a same or similar adoption date would be very helpful. And I can tell you in Burnsville's experience, we went 15 months with a different fire code than a building code. So I have a building official saying one thing and a fire official saying something different, and it gets confusing for those that are pulling permits. So we'd like to get that process aligned. We have some cleanup for the PERA provision on the Hometown Heroes Act that was in last year's omnibus pension bill that would require PERA to follow the Department of Public Safety's, Commissioner of Public Safety's determination on whether it's a line of duty death or not, so that the grieving families don't have to go through multiple processes to get their benefits. We would like to advocate for inspecting private and parochial schools. Currently only public and charter schools are inspected, and we think that all the kids in the state need to have a fire inspection to make sure that their school is safe. And then we want to eliminate the use of cancer-causing flame retardants. We got 4 of those chemicals adopted, I think it was 3 years ago, 2014, 2015 timeframe. There's 6 more chemicals that are showing, the flame retardants are showing to cause cancer in firefighters. And then the last thing is we continue to work with Homeland Security and the rail industry on rail safety initiatives to make sure we have the information and response capabilities in the event we were to have something like that in Minnesota. So that is a quick overview of everything we have going on. I could talk a lot longer. It was a very high-level overview. I really appreciate your time, your interest in the fire service, and your support of the fire service. It means a lot to us. My contact information is up at the top, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns or any thoughts.
Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You mentioned in one of your slides that you're looking at the sustainability of the current models and that you are looking at other models in the future. Could you share with us a little bit what those models look like?
Mr. Jungman.
Mr. Chair and committee members, the fire taxing district is a perfect example of one of those. Can 2 or more communities come together and be more efficient? I can tell you, sorry, the name of the 2 departments slipped away from me, but Central Minnesota, 2 rural departments came together to create one department, and they consolidated to one fire station. So instead of having 2 40-member departments, they were able to consolidate to one 40-member department and finally have the staff they need to run that volunteer fire department. So things like that, making it easier so departments can consolidate and be more efficient, would be an example of that, of a way to do that, as well as looking, if we do have to hire staff, what's the best way to do that and use them economically and efficiently. And again, I think that model of collaboration is really the future of the fire service.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've observed that you get a lot of your funding from the fire safety account. The legislature makes those allocations as well. So my question is, do you receive any reimbursement for any of your responses? For example, if you have responses to a train derailment, do you receive any reimbursement for the acts that you take? In the event that someone is handling chemicals and hazardous materials in a manner that's improper and it results in you coming out, do you receive any reimbursement of your costs for that? And if so, how do you get it? and what do you use it for?
Mr. Jungman?
Mr. Chair, committee members, the easy answer is it depends. But realistically, that's up to the local jurisdiction to figure out if in their fee schedule, if they have that allocated that they can bill back to the responsible party. What I would tell you is most often in the hazardous materials world, particularly with the regional response team, is we've created a fund that allows us to pay for the chemical assessment team, the regional team that comes out, and reimburse them if there's a responsible party. If there's not a responsible party, there's a fund set up to reimburse the regional response team for the response. But the local municipality is up to that local unit of government to have that in their fee schedule and to charge the responsible party.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the local jurisdiction then would find someone, for example, criminally responsible or civilly responsible for their conduct, and then they would go after them, and you then potentially could get some reimbursement for those
Mr. Jungman?
acts.
Mr. Chair and committee members, that is correct. Many times, it doesn't necessarily have to be a legal battle. Lots of times, once there's an insurance company involved, we can work with them to figure out the reimbursement process.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what fund does that go into? Just the local jurisdiction, or do you get some of that? And then who determines how that's spent?
Mr. Jungman.
Mr. Chair and committee members, so the state takes care of the reimbursement of the regional response teams, and that'll go directly to the direct costs of the regional response teams to respond, the personnel costs and the equipment that was used, the disposables, things like that. And so there's really two different bills that would happen. From the state aspect, HSEM, Homeland Security Emergency Management, would take care of the regional response billing and get that money back to reimburse that department that responded, because each of those regional response teams are hosted by a fire department. So that department would be reimbursed. The local unit of government, it would be up to them what they use that for, but generally it's got to be direct costs associated with that response to reimburse the department for disposables and time spent on that response.
Final question, Mr. Chair.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And who would have the data? Who would I request the data from of anybody that was held accountable? How much money was actually collected and how much any local unit of government might have been reimbursed?
Mr. Jungman.
Mr. Chair, committee members, that would be Homeland Security Emergency Management for the state side. I will tell you that I believe that fund is somewhat new, so I don't know how much data has been collected yet. And then it would be up to local units of government for the city type of reimbursement or local reimbursement. It's going to be difficult to get in a local environment because they don't happen very often, thankfully. But I don't know if there's a lot of data out there.
All right, thank you.
Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Following up on what Representative Hillstrom was just talking about, when I was on the city council in Mankato, we had 1,600 medical calls, and I noticed you said that's the fastest growing. What we discovered was a significant number of them were going to nursing homes and assisted living where I've fallen and I can't get up, and there was insufficient staff, or the person was somebody like me and they couldn't pick them up. So I think we need to also look at reimbursement from those private entities when they're failing to staff their institutions with the ability to take care of their folks.
Thank you, Representative Considine. If I remember right, I've been looking into that issue myself, and there's, because of some of the way the statutes are, I think fire departments having problem billing on medical calls.
We can change that.
Like I say, I've been looking into that issue. But there's some other issues to deal with that. Is there any Representative Dean?
One quick question. We had some testimony the other day about forest fires and recovery of costs associated with forest fires from individuals who may have been arsons. Do you have any indication or any knowledge of how many times the state or the agency, whoever it was, has gone after an individual, and what type of funds were actually recovered from that individual?
Mr. Jungman?
Mr. Chair and committee members, I'm not aware of any. I think that would be a good question for DNR. the Department of Natural Resources really handles that, and anything significant they're involved in. So I would think they'd probably be the more appropriate agency to ask of that. I don't have any information that would be helpful.
Okay, just one quick follow-up, Mr. Chair. So you all haven't gotten any money to help with, some of these different areas of firefighters' funds and things? You haven't gotten any money from DNR, from the state specifically that you know about?
Mr. Jungman?
Mr. Chair and committee members, so there's a couple of programs through the DNR. One's a volunteer grant, a 50/50 grant that matches for equipment for departments that are 10,000 or less for wildland fire equipment. So there's that. I know when they get to a certain point, they may be reimbursable if a disaster declaration is declared or if there's a responsible party. I would tell you, I personally haven't been involved in anything that big where I could speak to what the reimbursement is. I know there's a process if they're able to recapture that, but I don't know of anybody getting a lot of money from that. And I'm not aware of anybody getting money back from that, but I know that if you're deployed for a number of days, there's a way to get reimbursed, particularly those departments rural departments that partner with the DNR. There's a rate for a fire engine to go out or a grass rig to go out and assist them. I don't know what that threshold is, and I don't know how often it's used.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Mr. Jungman, I want to thank you for coming here. Then I want to thank all volunteer firefighters out there. As we learned, there's about 19,000 of them. I give them a lot of credit because as a former volunteer firefighter, I know how much time, how much training that's taken away from their families. And we need to do some work to try to do some things for them because it's very important to the safety of our public. They've done a great job in fire prevention. Fires across the state are down, but their calls are up because of increasing medical costs, ambulance service. They're changing things around, and they are stepping up to the plate to cover those areas and helping out. So thank you very much.
Thank you.